So I want to talk about some terms in the antiquarian book world which will change your life forever. Now, of course, these things are not going to change your life forever. It's a little bit of clickbait in the title because I have to compete on YouTube with all those adorable, hysterical cats. But these are terms that are poetry to the ears of antiquarian booksellers, especially to my ears. So I'm going to illustrate some of my favorite book terms with a few nice examples. First one, limp vellum. This is a nice copy of a book on sculpture from the year 1638. Vellum was an old utilitarian, very sturdy material, very inexpensive, and used on a lot of old book bindings. But when it's used as a simple vellum sheet to cover the book, it's very limp. It's not supported underneath. It often shrinks over time. But in doing so, it creates this wonderful old wrinkled effect, which I just love. So this is a fine example of a limp vellum binding. Binder's waste. This is a copy of Plinius's Natural History from 1554. Now, in old bookbinding workshops, a lot of times they did not want to waste medieval manuscripts or fragments, and they often reused them. So they would use them to support the spine, or they would use them as compressed boards, or in this case, they used it partially as an end paper to the book. This is a fragment of a 15th century French manuscript. I haven't studied it yet, but you can make amazing discoveries because sometimes those manuscripts can be from important medieval texts, and they may be the only surviving copy of a fragment of a manuscript. So I always pay careful attention to binder's waste. A sammelband. In centuries past, if you bought several unbound texts and you had them bound in a single volume, we call that a sammelband. In this particular example, this is a collection of 19th century American economic tracts. And there's probably 8 or 9 separate tracts in here that might have been bound for an English parliamentarian in this case, or an economist or something to that effect. And when they're bound as a single volume like this, we call that a sammelband. I love this one, deckled edges. This is a copy of Thornton's paper credit. Thornton was an extremely important economist and actually the father of the central bank. But what I want to illustrate are the deckled edges or the uncut edges. The decal is like the frame when you do paper making and you put it into the vat. But sometimes the paper seeps through to the edges and creates a rough appearance. Now a bookbinder or somebody might cut those edges to make it look more refined or elegant in the final production. But sometimes they left them uncut. And when an antiquarian bookseller today, from a modern vantage point, finds a book in its original state with its deckled edges, it's just a thing of beauty. Bosses. We all hate our bosses, but not these metal bosses. These are applied to an 18th century Spanish hymnal printed by Ibarra. If you've ever seen The Ninth Gate with Johnny Depp, in one of my favorite scenes in the beginning of the movie, he goes in and he purchases, or he weasels out of an apartment, a copy of Ibarra's Don Quixote. So they've applied to this book the metal bosses, which act like a type of door stopper, preventing damage of the softer underlying calf when books bang up against each other in a church or on a library shelf or something that. And when they survive, I just love old metalwork, and it's a beautiful looking bookbinding. Incipit. Incipit is the beginning, the first line of a medieval manuscript. In this case, this is a 15th century northern French manuscript, some very beautiful penwork. And if you read auction descriptions or catalogs of old medieval manuscripts, they always start with the incipit to give some information about the book. So the first line here is what we call the incipit of the medieval manuscript. Black letter. Black letter or Gothic type comes out of the medieval calligraphic tradition. It often looks like very dark and thin lines. Gutenberg printed the first Bible in Gothic typeface. But when I think about black letter, for me personally, I think about early English printing, which I love. This is a copy from 1533 of Fabian's Chronicle, an early English historical chronicle, and it is printed throughout in beautiful black letter. Moving on, goffered. This is an 18th century Roman missal, and a lot of times to make books look luxurious, they would gild the edges of the book. But after, in some copies, and this dates back to 16th century German books especially, and onwards throughout the continent, they would take a heated finishing tool to go over the gold and make a repeated design. And it gives such a beautiful, luxurious look to the book, and we call those goffered edges. Rubrication. This is a book from 1487, an incunable, one of the earliest printed books. And printed books were new to people. They were used to manuscripts and scribes. And the earliest printers, when they printed the book, they wanted them to look, for either marketing purposes or beauty, to look like old manuscripts. So after they were printed, they hired a rubricator to draw in these very beautiful rubrics throughout the book. Colors make them look more like medieval manuscripts. So we call that rubrication. And finally, Dentelles. This is a 18th century copy of Dorot's Fables, probably bound in the 19th century though. The French love luxurious looking books, bindings, crushed Morocco, a lot of gilt tooling. But when the gilt tooling is applied inside along the inner edges, it creates an especially luxurious effect, often signifying an important book inside, and we call those dentelles. In this particular case, the tooling shows it looks like some cornucopias, some birds. It's just gorgeous and lovely. So dentelles, kiss and dentelle. So those are some antiquarian books, antiquarian book terms of which I'm particularly fond. And I encourage you to go online and look up a glossary of old book terms, especially if you're interested in old and rare books. And I will hope you will subscribe to some more videos. I'll share some more tips, some more secrets of the trade, and hopefully the joy and love of old and rare books.